What started as a simple walk in the countryside turned into a jaw-dropping scene when a kid came across a wild animal trapped in barbed wire. But it wasn't just any animal. It was a bobcat, scared, hurt, and dangerous. What this kid did next goes against everything any adult would have done, but the most amazing part was still to come. Watch until the end and get ready for an unbelievable twist. And if you love real stories that hit you right in the feels, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. The world needs to see it. In the dense wilderness of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, 16-year-old Ethan Campbell had always found solace. The son of a forest ranger, he'd grown up surrounded by towering pines and the whispering secrets of nature. While other teenagers in the small town of Pine Ridge spent their weekends at the local diner or movie theater, Ethan preferred the company of birdsong and rustling leaves. On this particular Saturday morning in late September, he decided to explore a trail he'd never taken before. His father had warned him about venturing too deep into the less traveled parts of the forest, but Ethan couldn't resist the pull of discovery. With his worn backpack filled with water, trail mix, and his grandfather's old compass, he set off at dawn, the morning dew still clinging to the wildflowers that dotted the path. 3 hours into his hike, the trail became less defined, and the forest thickened around him. The familiar sounds of the woods seemed different here, more primal, more alive. Ethan paused to check his compass when an unusual sound broke through the natural symphony of the forest. A pained, guttural growl, followed by a metallic scraping. Noise! "What the hell?" he muttered, his curiosity piqued. Following the sound cautiously, Ethan pushed through a dense thicket of underbrush. What he found made his heart skip a beat. A bobcat, its tawny coat marked with distinctive black spots, was entangled in a mess of barbed wire. The animal's amber eyes were wide with pain and fear, its powerful limbs bloodied from desperate attempts to free itself. Ethan's first instinct was to back away. He knew the dangers of approaching injured wild animals, especially predators. His father's warnings echoed in his mind. A cornered animal is unpredictable. But something about the bobcat's struggle resonated with him on a deeper level. The creature's eyes seemed to hold not just fear, but a profound understanding of its predicament. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, taking a tentative step forward. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The bobcat hissed, but the sound was weak, lacking the usual ferocity of its kind. It had clearly been trapped for hours, maybe even a day, and its strength was waning. Ethan's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The barbed wire appeared to be from an old fence, probably leftover from when this area had been partially settled decades ago. Time and the elements had caused it to collapse, creating a deadly snare for unsuspecting wildlife. Taking a deep breath, Ethan slowly removed his jacket. If he could cover the bobcat's head, he might be able to work on freeing it without getting mauled. It was a risky plan, but he couldn't just leave the animal to suffer. "Okay, this is probably a really stupid idea," he whispered to himself, inching forward with his jacket extended. "Please don't take my face off." The tension in the air was thick as Ethan approached. The bobcat's muscles tensed, but to his astonishment it didn't lunge at him. Instead, it went eerily still, as if it somehow understood his intentions. With careful movements, Ethan managed to drape his jacket over the animal's head and upper body. For the next 20 minutes, he worked meticulously to untangle the barbed wire from the bobcat's flesh. His hands trembled with each careful maneuver, knowing that one wrong move could provoke an attack. The wire had cut deep in places, and Ethan winced at the animal's wounds. "Almost there," he murmured encouragingly, as much to himself as to the bobcat. "Just one more there." The final piece of wire came free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, in a fluid motion, the bobcat slipped out from under the jacket and bounded a few feet away. but instead of disappearing into the forest as Ethan expected, it turned and stared at him. Time seemed to stand still as boy and wildcat regarded each other. The bobcat's gaze was penetrating, almost sentient in its intensity. It wasn't the look of a simple predator. There was something more, an acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Then with a twitch of its ears, it melted into the forest shadows. Ethan remained kneeling on the forest floor, his hands smeared with the bobcat's blood, his heart pounding with adrenaline and something else he couldn't quite name. The encounter had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It felt significant, though he couldn't explain why. Gathering his jacket and backpack, Ethan began the long trek home, glancing over his shoulder more than once with the strange sensation that he was being watched. The Campbell home sat on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, a modest, two-story structure with a wraparound porch that offered spectacular views of the mountains. As Ethan approached, he could see his father, James, chopping wood in the yard. At 52, James Campbell was still powerfully built, his weathered face a testament to decades spent outdoors. "You're back late," James called out, setting down his axe. His expression shifted to concern when he noticed the blood on Ethan's hands. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Dad," Ethan assured him. "I found a bobcat caught in some old barbed wire and helped it get free." James's eyebrows shot up. "You did what?" "Ethan, that was incredibly dangerous. Wounded wild animals." I know," Ethan interrupted, "but I couldn't just leave it there to die. It was strange, though. It was like it knew I was trying to help." His father frowned. "That's your imagination talking. Wild animals don't reason like that. You're lucky you didn't end up needing stitches, or worse." Ethan nodded, but deep down he knew what he'd experienced was real. The connection he'd felt with the bobcat wasn't something he could easily dismiss. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bobcat's intense gaze. Outside his window, the forest loomed dark and mysterious, and somewhere within its depths, a wounded bobcat roamed, a creature that now shared a strange bond with him. The following days brought subtle changes to the Campbell property. Ethan noticed them before anyone else did. Paw prints in the soft earth near the tree line, claw marks on a pine tree not far from his bedroom window, the occasional rustling in the underbrush when he sat on the porch in the evenings. "Dad," Ethan said over breakfast one morning, a week after the incident, "I think the bobcat is hanging around our place." James lowered his newspaper, his expression skeptical. "That's highly unlikely, son. Bobcats are solitary creatures that avoid human contact. It's probably just passing through the area." But Ethan wasn't convinced. That afternoon, he left a small offering at the edge of the forest, a piece of raw chicken from the refrigerator. The next morning it was gone, with distinct feline tracks surrounding the spot. Madison Reynolds, Ethan's classmate and the daughter of the local veterinarian, noticed his distraction during their shared biology class. "Earth to Ethan," she said, waving a hand in front of his face. "You've been staring out the window for the past 10 minutes. What's so interesting out there?" Madison had moved to Pine Ridge 3 years ago, and while they weren't exactly close friends, they shared a mutual respect and an interest in the natural world. Her long auburn hair was always tied back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes missed very little. "Sorry," Ethan said, turning his attention back to their lab assignment, "just thinking about something I saw in the forest last weekend." "Must have been something pretty amazing to have you this zoned out," Madison remarked. Ethan hesitated. Would she think he was crazy if he told her about the bobcat and the strange connection he felt? But Madison wasn't like most people in town. Her father's veterinary practice meant she understood animals better than most. "I helped free a bobcat from some barbed wire," he finally said, "and now I think it's been hanging around my house." Instead of the skepticism he expected, Madison's eyes lit up with interest. "Seriously? That's unusual. Bobcats don't typically form attachments to humans." "I know, but this felt different. There was this moment when we looked at each other, And it was like, I don't know how to explain it. Madison tapped her pencil against her notebook thoughtfully. Actually, my dad was just telling me about some research on animal cognition and emotional intelligence. Some species have demonstrated remarkable awareness and even gratitude-like behaviors. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. For the first time since the encounter, Ethan felt understood. So you don't think I'm imagining things? I think there's a lot about animal behavior we don't fully understand yet, Madison replied. And I think you might have experienced something pretty special. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Madison added, you know, if you're worried about its wounds getting infected, I could ask my dad for some advice. Or maybe even come check it out sometime. Ethan nodded, grateful for her offer and lack of judgment. That would be great. Thanks, Madison. Little did either of them know that this conversation was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and the wild. And as Ethan walked home that afternoon, the sensation of being watched returned. A pair of amber eyes tracking his movements from the safety of the forest shadows, a silent guardian whose presence would soon become undeniable in ways none of them could have anticipated. 2 weeks after his encounter with the Bobcat, Ethan had settled into a new routine. Each evening, he would leave small offerings at the edge of the forest, sometimes raw meat, other times fresh water in a shallow dish. Each morning, the offerings would be gone, with only distinct paw prints as evidence of his visitor. Though he never caught a clear glimpse of the Bobcat, Ethan sensed its presence constantly. It was as if the forest itself had taken on a new dimension, becoming a conduit for this unspoken connection between boy and wildcat. His father remained skeptical, attributing the disappearing food to raccoons or other scavengers. But Ethan knew better. You're wasting perfectly good meat, James commented one evening as he watched Ethan place a small cut of venison on a flat rock by the tree line. And encouraging wild animals to associate our property with food isn't a great idea, son. It's just until its wounds heal, Ethan replied, though deep down he wondered if his motivations went beyond simple concern for the animal's recovery. Madison had become his confidant in this strange new chapter of his life. During lunch breaks, at Pine Ridge High, they would sit at the far table by the windows overlooking the mountains, and Ethan would share updates about his silent communion with the forest. I still haven't actually seen it again, he admitted one day in early October, as autumn painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. But I know it's there. It's like I can feel it watching over me. Madison tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. You know, indigenous cultures around the world believe in spirit animals or animal guides. They say these creatures choose you, not the other way around. You think I've been chosen by a bobcat? Ethan asked with a half smile. I think something unusual is happening, she replied seriously, and I don't think it's random. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Blake Thompson, the school's star quarterback and self-appointed king of Pine Ridge High. His father owned the largest logging company in the county, and Blake carried himself with the entitled air of someone who believed the world existed for his benefit. Well, if it isn't Campbell and his girlfriend, Blake sneered, leaning against their table, planning another nature date to go hug trees. Ethan tensed but remained silent. Blake had been his tormentor since elementary school, and experience had taught him that engaging only made things worse. Madison, however, had no such reservations. Don't you have something better to do, Blake? Like practicing how to actually throw a football accurately? Blake's face darkened. The team had lost their last game largely due to his poor performance. Watch it, Reynolds. Your dad's business depends on people like mine for survival. One word from my father, and everyone in town would take their pets elsewhere. Is threatening people the only way you know how to interact? Ethan found himself saying, surprising even himself with his boldness. That's pretty sad, man. Blake straightened, his expression dangerous. You know what's sad, Campbell? That jacket you're always wearing. But I guess forest rangers don't exactly make the big bucks, do they? With that, he sauntered away, laughing, with his friends who had been watching the exchange from a nearby table. Ignore him, Madison said, noticing Ethan's clenched fists. He's just insecure and threatened by anyone who doesn't worship him. Ethan nodded. But Blake's words had struck a nerve. The Thompsons represented everything his father stood against: exploitation of the land for profit, with little regard for conservation or sustainability. The tension between the Forest Service and Thompson logging had been a constant backdrop to life in Pine Ridge for as long as Ethan could remember. That afternoon, instead of heading straight home, Ethan decided to take a detour through one of his favorite trails. The path was unmarked and little known, winding through a particularly beautiful section of old-growth forest that James had shown him years ago. The massive trees here had stood for centuries, their sprawling canopies creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that always brought Ethan a sense of peace. The air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter, and fallen leaves crunched satisfyingly beneath his boots. Ethan breathed deeply, letting the forest calm his lingering anger from the encounter with Blake. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the sound of approaching dogs. The barking came suddenly, aggressive and alarmingly close. Before Ethan could react, 3 large dogs burst from the undergrowth ahead. He recognized them immediately as the hunting dogs belonging to Roy Dawson, a local farmer known for his bad temper and disregard for property boundaries. The dogs, trained for tracking and cornering, fixed their attention on Ethan with predatory focus. The largest of the 3, a muscular Catahoula with a patchy coat and scarred muzzle, bared its teeth in a menacing growl. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he slowly backed away. "Easy," he said in what he hoped was a calm voice. "Easy. There." But the dogs advanced, their barking intensifying. Ethan glanced around frantically for an escape route or something he could use to defend himself. The trail behind him was clear, but he knew he couldn't outrun the dogs, and climbing a tree would take precious seconds he might not have. The lead dog lunged forward, and Ethan braced himself for the attack. But it never came. A blur of tawny, fur and muscle intercepted the dog mid-leap. The bobcat, his bobcat, had emerged from nowhere, positioning itself between Ethan and the threat. Though smaller than the dogs, the wild feline radiated a ferocity that made the canines hesitate. The bobcat's stance was protective, its muscles coiled and ready. It emitted a low, rumbling growl that seemed to resonate through the forest floor. The dogs faltered, their pack mentality momentarily disrupted by this unexpected challenger. For several heart-stopping seconds, a silent standoff ensued. The dogs circled warily, reassessing the situation. The bobcat remained unmoved, its amber eyes fixed on the threat, its body a living shield for the boy behind it. Then, remarkably, the dogs began to back away. Something in the bobcat's unwavering stance or fierce determination had communicated. A message more powerful than size or strength. This human was under protection. The pack retreated, disappearing back into the forest with frustrated yelps. When the danger had passed, the bobcat turned to face Ethan. Its wounds from the barbed wire were healing well, the fur beginning to grow back over the scars. Their eyes met once again in that same profound connection he had felt during their first encounter. "You protected me," Ethan whispered, awe in his voice. "You actually protected me." The bobcat blinked slowly, a gesture that seemed almost affectionate, before slipping back into the shadows of the forest. But this time, Ethan didn't feel abandoned. He knew with absolute certainty that the wildcat remained nearby, an invisible guardian watching over him. That evening, Ethan recounted the experience to his father, his words tumbling out in excited rushes. "It was the same bobcat, Dad. I'm sure of it." It saved me from those dogs. James listened with growing concern. Dawson's hunting dogs were running loose again? I'll have to report that to the rangers. Those animals are dangerous. But Dad, did you hear what I said? The bobcat protected me. It stood between me and the dogs. It wasn't afraid at all. His father sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Ethan, I know you believe something special is happening, but there are rational explanations. The bobcat probably saw the dogs as competitors in its territory. It wasn't protecting you, it was defending its hunting grounds. You weren't there. Ethan insisted. You didn't see how it looked at me afterward. It knows me. Son, James said gently, I understand the appeal of believing in this connection. Nature is powerful and mysterious, but projecting human emotions onto wild animals can be dangerous. That bobcat is still a predator with instincts that we can't fully predict. Ethan fell silent, recognizing the futility of trying to convince his father. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? This wasn't just about a wild animal behaving unusually. It was about a bond that transcended the expected boundaries between humans and nature. That night, he called Madison and shared everything that had happened. I wish I could have seen it, she said, unable to hide, the excitement in her voice. This is incredible, Ethan. It defies everything we understand about wild animal behavior. My dad thinks I'm romanticizing the whole thing, Ethan replied, staring out his bedroom window at the darkened forest beyond. He says the bobcat was just defending its territory against the dogs. And what do you think? Ethan considered for a moment. I think there's something more going on, something, I don't know, almost magical. Maybe it's not magic, Madison suggested thoughtfully. Maybe it's just nature operating on a level we don't fully comprehend yet. Either way, I want to see this bobcat for myself. Tomorrow's Saturday. What if I come over and we set up a wildlife camera? The plan energized. Ethan, Madison's scientific approach might provide evidence that would validate what he knew in his heart to be true. And beyond that, sharing this experience with someone who believed him felt important. That sounds perfect, he agreed. Come over around 10? After they hung up, Ethan opened his window and leaned out, breathing in the cool night air. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew his unlikely guardian was watching. He couldn't see the bobcat, but he could feel its presence, a reassuring awareness that hummed like a subtle current between them. Thank you, he whispered to the night, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. He wasn't sure if the bobcat could understand human speech, but he was increasingly certain it understood something far more fundamental, the language of connection, respect, and mutual protection. Little did Ethan know that this extraordinary bond would soon face its greatest test, one that would shake not only his life, but the entire community of Pine Ridge to its core. Forces were already in motion that would threaten everything he held dear, and the silent covenant between boy and wildcat would be drawn into a conflict far larger than either of them. Saturday morning arrived with a thin layer of frost coating. The ground, the first real hint that winter was approaching the Montana wilderness. Ethan was up before dawn, too excited about Madison's visit to sleep in. He spent the early hours setting up the perfect spots for wildlife cameras, identifying locations where he had found the bobcat's prints most consistently. Madison arrived. Promptly at 10, her father's pickup truck rumbling up the gravel driveway. She hopped out carrying a backpack full of equipment, 2 trail cameras, a laptop, and various other gadgets that spoke to her scientific approach to their mission. Dad thinks I'm doing a school project on local wildlife, she explained as she joined Ethan on the porch. Which isn't entirely untrue. James Campbell greeted Madison warmly. Despite his skepticism about Ethan's bobcat theories, he had always appreciated Madison's intellectual curiosity and practical nature. You two be careful out there, he cautioned, as they prepared to head into the forest. And stay within range of the walkie-talkies. We will, Mr. Campbell, Madison assured him. "We're just setting up some cameras, nothing dangerous." Once they were on the trail, Ethan led Madison to the spots he had selected. The first was near the flat rock where he left food. The second, by a distinctive pine tree with claw marks scoring its trunk. And the third, near a small stream where he had found fresh paw prints just the day before. "These are perfect," Madison said as they secured the last camera. "Now we wait. The cameras will trigger with any movement and capture images day or night." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the forest, with Ethan sharing his extensive knowledge of the local ecosystem. It felt good to have someone who understood his passion for the wilderness, someone who didn't dismiss his experiences or try to explain them away with cold rationality. "So, what made you so interested in animal behavior?" Ethan asked as they sat on a fallen log, sharing the lunch they had packed. Madison took a bite of her sandwich before answering. "When I was 9, I found an injured hawk in our backyard in Denver. My dad and I nursed it back to health over several weeks. The day we released it, it circled above our house 3 times before flying away. Dad said it was just orienting itself, but I always felt like it was saying thank you." She smiled at the memory. "After that, I read everything I could find about animal intelligence and consciousness. And what do you think now about whether animals are really conscious like we are?" She considered the question carefully. "I think consciousness exists on a spectrum. Different animals experience it in different ways, but I absolutely believe they have emotional lives and intelligence that we're only beginning to understand." Their conversation was interrupted by distant sounds of machinery, the unmistakable roar of chainsaws and the rumble of heavy equipment. "That's strange," Ethan frowned. "There shouldn't be any logging operations this deep in the protected area." They packed up their lunch and followed the sounds, eventually coming to a ridge that overlooked a valley below. What they saw made Ethan's stomach drop. A crew of men with Thompson logging jackets were cutting down trees, and heavy equipment was already stacking the massive trunks for transport. "This can't be legal," Madison whispered. "This is part of the protected watershed, isn't it?" Ethan nodded grimly. "My dad's been fighting to expand the conservation area for years, but Thompson's been pushing back. Looks like they're not waiting for the legal battle to play out." They crouched lower as one of the workers looked in their direction. Ethan recognized Blake's father, Richard Thompson, directing operations from beside a large truck. His commanding presence and expensive outdoor gear contrasted sharply with the working men around him. "We need to document this," Madison said, pulling out her phone and quietly taking photos. "Your dad needs to see this." Just as they were about to retreat, Ethan spotted something that made his blood run cold. A worker pointing toward a disturbance in the underbrush, another reaching for a rifle that had been leaning against a tree. A familiar tawny shape was moving stealthily at the edge of the clearing. "The Bobcat," Ethan breathed. "It's down there." Without thinking, he stood up. "Hey!" he shouted. "Stop!" His voice carried across the valley, causing the workers to look up in surprise. The man with the rifle hesitated. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Madison hissed, tugging at his jacket. "I can't let them hurt it," he replied, already scrambling down the slope toward the logging operation. Madison had no choice but to follow. By the time they reached the bottom, Richard Thompson had spotted them and was striding over, his expression thunderous. "Campbell's kid," he said with a sneer. "Should have known. Spying for your father. Are you?" "You're logging in a protected area," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "These trees are part of the watershed conservation project." Thompson's laugh was dismissive. "This area is under dispute, boy. The courts haven't made a final ruling, and I have permits for adjacent parcels. Now why don't you and your girlfriend run along before you get hurt in a work zone?" Ethan stood his ground. "One of your men was about to shoot at wildlife. That's illegal, regardless of where you're logging." "When predators threaten my crew, we deal with them," Thompson replied coldly. "Now I'm not going to tell you again to leave." Blake emerged from behind a stack of logs, his surprise at seeing his classmates quickly morphing into malicious delight. "Well, look who it is," he said, sauntering over. "The tree hugger and his science nerd." "We have photos," Madison said, holding up her phone. "We're reporting this to the Forest Service and the county sheriff." Richard Thompson's expression darkened. "Hand over that phone." "No way!" Madison stepped back, clutching her phone tightly. The tension was broken by a shout from one of the workers. "Boss, we've got a problem with the hydraulics on the skidder." Thompson hesitated, clearly torn between dealing with the teenagers and addressing the equipment issue. "Blake, keep an eye on them," he ordered before striding away. Blake moved closer, his posture menacing. "Delete those photos, Reynolds." "Not happening," she replied, but her voice wavered slightly. Ethan positioned himself between Blake and Madison. "Back off, Thompson. This isn't going to end well for your family's company." Blake's face contorted with anger. "You think you're so much better than everyone, don't you, Campbell? You and your forest ranger dad, acting like you own these mountains." He shoved Ethan hard, causing him to stumble backward. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Blake advanced, a blur of movement erupted from the nearby brush. The Bobcat launched itself not at Blake, but between him and Ethan, landing in a defensive posture, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Blake froze, his face draining of color. The workers nearby stopped what they were doing, staring in disbelief at the standoff. "Don't move," Ethan said quietly to Blake. "It won't hurt you if you back away slowly." For once, Blake listened, taking careful steps backward until he was a safe distance away. The Bobcat remained poised between the boys, its amber eyes never leaving Blake. "What the hell?" Blake whispered. "That thing is protecting you." The Bobcat glanced back at Ethan, their eyes meeting in that now familiar connection. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished back into the forest. The entire logging crew had witnessed the bizarre encounter. Murmurs spread among the workers as Richard Thompson returned to the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking from the stunned expression on his son's face to Ethan and Madison. "That crazy Bobcat almost attacked me," Blake exclaimed. "It wasn't attacking," Madison corrected. "It was defending." Thompson looked skeptical. "A Bobcat defending humans? That's ridiculous." "It's true," said one of the workers, stepping forward. "I've never seen anything like it. That cat positioned itself between the boys, like it was protecting the Campbell kid." More workers nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. The incident had clearly unsettled them, tapping into deep-seated human instincts about the natural world and its mysteries. Taking advantage of the confusion, Ethan and Madison backed away. "We're leaving now," Ethan said, "but those photos are going straight to the authorities." Thompson watched them go, his calculating eyes suggesting this confrontation was far from over. As they hiked quickly back toward the Campbell house, Madison's excitement was palpable. "That was incredible. The Bobcat actually came to your defense again, and this time there were witnesses." Ethan's mind was racing. "It must have been following us the whole time. It knew we were in trouble." When they reached Ethan's home, they found James in his study, surrounded by maps and forestry reports. His expression grew increasingly grave as they related everything that had happened and showed him the photos Madison had taken. "Thompson's pushing the boundaries again," James said wearily. "He's trying to establish operations before the court ruling, hoping it will influence the decision." He looked at the photos more closely. "But this is clearly over the line. I need to report this immediately." As James made calls to his colleagues at the Forest Service, Ethan and Madison sat on the porch, processing the day's events. "Do you realize what this means?" Madison said quietly. "Your connection with this Bobcat isn't just unusual, it's unprecedented. It's actively intervening to protect you. Twice now." Ethan nodded, still struggling to fully comprehend the significance. I keep thinking about what you said about indigenous beliefs in animal guides. Do you think that's what this is? I don't know, Madison admitted, but I think we're witnessing something that defies conventional scientific understanding. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. The Thompson family isn't going to take this lying down, you know. If your dad's report leads to their operation being shut down, they'll be looking for revenge. I know, Ethan sighed, but we couldn't just let them destroy that part of the forest. It's one of the oldest sections of woodland in the entire area. Some of those trees are hundreds of years old. Madison squeezed his hand supportively. We did the right thing, and apparently your Bobcat friend agrees. That evening, after Madison had gone home and James was still making calls in his study, Ethan went to the edge of the forest. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. He placed a generous portion of venison on the flat rock, a special thank you for the day's intervention. I don't know if you understand me, he said softly to the silent forest, but you saved me again today. You're putting yourself at risk for me, and I want you to know I'm going to protect you too, somehow. As if in response, a twig snapped in the underbrush. Ethan strained his eyes but could see nothing in the gathering darkness. Yet he felt the Bobcat's presence as surely as if it were standing right beside him. The next morning, the Forest Service arrived at the illegal logging site with cease and desist orders. James Campbell was among them, his face set with determination as they confronted Richard Thompson and his crew. The news spread quickly through Pine Ridge, polarizing the small town between those who supported the jobs and economic boost that Thompson logging provided and those who valued the protection of the ancient forest. Ethan knew that the battle lines had been drawn, and somehow at the center of it all was the extraordinary bond between a teenage boy and a wild bobcat. A relationship that would challenge not only the town's perceptions, but the very way humans understood their relationship with the natural world. And as tensions in Pine Ridge rose, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was approaching, a turning point that would change everything. The following week brought a palpable tension to Pine Ridge. The town, usually united by its small community bonds, had fractured along lines of conservation versus economic development. The Thompson Logging Company had been forced to halt operations in the disputed area pending a formal investigation, and Richard Thompson had made no secret of who he blamed for the interruption. At school, Blake had transformed from a typical bully into something more sinister. His glares across the cafeteria conveyed not just adolescent antagonism, but genuine hatred. Ethan tried to avoid him, but in a school with fewer than 300 students, encounters were inevitable. My dad lost a major contract because of your family, Blake hissed one day, cornering Ethan by the lockers. He had to lay off 3 guys already, people with families to feed. Ethan stood his ground. Your dad was logging in protected land. That's not on us. Blake's laugh was bitter. Protected land? It's trees, Campbell. Just trees. My family's been cutting them down for 3 generations, and they keep growing back. But you environmental types act like every pine is sacred. Madison appeared beside Ethan, her expression defiant. The ecosystem is more than just trees, Blake. Those old-growth forests support hundreds of species and protect the watershed that your family drinks from. But Blake wasn't interested in ecological lectures. You two think you're so smart. Let's see how smart you feel when this town turns against the Campbells for costing people their jobs. He stalked away, shouldering roughly past a freshman in his path. He's just trying to intimidate us, Madison said, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. Ethan nodded, but deep down, he understood the complex dynamics at play. Pine Ridge was a town where logging had provided livelihoods for generations. Environmental protection, while gaining traction, was still viewed by many as an external threat to their way of life. That evening, while helping his father prepare dinner, Ethan broached the subject. People in town are blaming us for the layoffs. At Thompson's, James sighed, setting down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. I've heard Richard Thompson is very good at controlling the narrative in this town, but we did the right thing, Ethan. That land is protected for a reason. I know, Dad. I just hate that it's becoming so personal. James placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Standing up for what's right isn't always popular. Your mother understood that better than anyone. His voice softened at the mention of Sarah Campbell, who had passed away from cancer when Ethan was just 10. She used to say that the easiest path is rarely the most important one. The memory of his mother's wisdom bolstered Ethan's resolve. She had been a wildlife biologist, her love for the natural world shaping both her career and her son's perspective. In many ways, Ethan's connection to the forest was a living tribute to her memory. Over the next few days, the trail cameras Ethan and Madison had set up began capturing extraordinary footage. The Bobcat appeared regularly, patrolling the perimeter of the Campbell property like a sentinel. In one particularly striking image, it stood on the flat rock where Ethan left food, looking directly at the camera with an almost human awareness. It's like it knows we're watching, Madison marveled as they reviewed the footage on her laptop. Maybe it does, Ethan replied. I swear it's getting more human in how it behaves. Last night I was sitting on the porch and it came right to the edge of the clearing. Just sat there watching me for almost 10 minutes before disappearing again. Madison's scientific mind was clearly struggling to reconcile these observations with conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. We should document everything. This could be groundbreaking. But Ethan was beginning to feel protective of their discovery. I'm not sure I want researchers descending on the forest, trying to capture it or tag it. This feels personal. She considered his words, then nodded. I get that. But at the same time, imagine how this could change how people view wildlife. Conservation. If people understood that animals are capable of this kind of connection, maybe they wouldn't be so quick to destroy their habitats. The conversation was interrupted by the ring of Ethan's phone. It was his father, his voice tense. Ethan, are you with Madison? You both need to come home right now. There's something you need to see. When they arrived at the Campbell house, they found James in the living room with Sheriff Tanner. The sheriff, a stout man with a perpetually tired expression, had known Ethan since he was a toddler. What's going on? Ethan asked, looking between the two men. Sheriff Tanner cleared, his throat uncomfortably. Richard Thompson has filed a formal complaint. He's claiming that you two were trespassing on private property and interfering with his business operations. He's also suggesting that you intentionally led a wild animal to threaten his workers. That's absurd, Madison exclaimed. The land isn't private. It's disputed territory, and we certainly didn't lead a bobcat anywhere. I know, the sheriff said placatingly. I'm just telling you what's been filed. Thompson has influence with the county commissioners, and he's pushing for charges. James's face was grim. It gets worse. Thompson has also applied for a special permit to remove dangerous wildlife from the area. He's claiming the bobcat poses a threat to his workers. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He can't do that. The bobcat didn't threaten anyone. It was just protecting me. That's not how Thompson is spinning it, Sheriff Tanner replied. He's got statements from his crew saying they felt endangered. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Look, James, you know I'm on your side here, but Thompson's making this personal. He's determined to make an example of your family. After the sheriff left, Ethan paced the living room, rage and helplessness battling within him. We can't let him kill the bobcat. We just can't. We won't, James assured him, though his expression was troubled. I've already called the State Wildlife Office. They're sending a representative to assess the situation. If they determine the Bobcat isn't a threat, Thompson won't get his permit. Madison, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly looked up from her phone. The wildlife assessment isn't until next week, right? That might be too late. What do you mean? Ethan asked. She showed them her screen, displaying a private social media post from one of Blake's friends. Thompson's men are going into the forest tomorrow. They're not waiting for the permit. They're going to hunt the Bobcat themselves and claim self-defense, if it comes to that. Ethan's heart raced. Dad, we have to stop them. James reached for his phone. I'll call Sheriff Tanner back. Without a permit, they can't legally hunt that Bobcat. Deal. And if the sheriff doesn't get there in time, Ethan challenged. You know how these things work. They'll shoot first and deal with the consequences later. His father looked torn. What do you suggest, Ethan? We can't take the law into our own hands. We don't have to. We just need to find the Bobcat first and make sure it stays away from Thompson's men until the authorities arrive. Madison nodded in agreement. We have the trail cameras. We know its patterns better than anyone. We might be able to locate it and keep it away from the logging site. James ran a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. This is dangerous. Ethan, wild animals are unpredictable, even ones that seem to have bonded with you. Dad, you've always taught me to protect what matters. This matters. This Bobcat saved me. Twice. I can't just stand by while Thompson's men hunt it down. After a long moment, James nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I'm coming with you, and we're calling Sheriff Tanner to meet us there. No heroics, understand? Before dawn the next morning, Ethan, Madison, and James set out into the forest, equipped with walkie-talkies and the coordinates from their trail cameras. Sheriff Tanner had promised to meet them as soon as possible, but warned that he was handling an accident on the highway first. The early morning mist hung low among the trees, limiting visibility and lending an ethereal quality to the landscape. They split up to cover more ground, staying within radio contact of each other. Ethan took the northeastern section, where the cameras had most frequently captured the Bobcat's movements. The forest was unusually quiet, as if the wildlife sensed the tension in the air. Ethan moved carefully, scanning for any sign of his feline guardian. Where are you? He whispered to the silent trees. We need to keep you safe. After an hour of searching, his walkie-talkie crackled to life. Ethan! It was Madison, her voice urgent. I can see Thompson's trucks on the logging road. They're heading into the disputed area now. At least 5 men, and they're carrying rifles. Any sign of the Bobcat? Ethan asked. No, but her transmission cut off abruptly. Madison? Madison, come in. Ethan's heart pounded as he waited for a response. James's voice came through instead. Ethan, head to the ridge point. I can see Thompson's men spreading out below. They're moving into the old growth section. Ethan changed direction, moving as quickly as he dared through the dense underbrush. As he approached the ridge, he heard voices, angry, determined voices that carried through the morning air. Fan out! Check those ravines. The ranger's kid said it was hanging around this area. Richard Thompson's commanding tone was unmistakable. Ethan crouched low, peering through a screen of ferns. Thompson stood with 4 men, including Blake, all carrying hunting rifles. They were methodically moving through the forest, clearly searching for the Bobcat. A movement to his right caught Ethan's eye. His heart sank as he spotted the familiar tawny coat moving through the shadows. The Bobcat was approaching, perhaps, drawn by Ethan's presence or some sixth sense that its territory was under threat. No, Ethan whispered desperately. Stay back. But the Bobcat continued its advance, its movements deliberate and unafraid. It would be visible to the hunters any moment. In a split-second decision, Ethan whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the forest silence. All heads turned in his direction, including the Bobcats. There! Blake shouted, pointing toward Ethan's position. Ethan stood, making himself fully visible. Stop! He called out. You don't have a permit to hunt that bobcat. Richard Thompson's expression darkened. This isn't hunting, boy. This is pest control. That animal threatened my son and my workers. That's a lie, and you know it, Ethan replied, his voice steadier than he felt. It never attacked anyone. Blake moved to his father's side, rifle raised. It's probably around here somewhere. It always shows up when Campbell's nearby. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between the hunters and where he'd last seen the bobcat. The sheriff is on his way. If you shoot that bobcat, you'll be breaking the law. We'll take our chances, Thompson replied coldly. Blake, check that ravine. As Blake moved away from the group, Ethan heard the sound he'd been dreading, the soft rustle of movement as the bobcat circled around, tracking Blake's movements. Blake, stop, Ethan called out. Just walk back to your father slowly. Blake turned, his expression suspicious. Why? What's... His words died as he spotted the bobcat emerging from the underbrush, its amber eyes fixed on him. Don't move, Ethan said quietly. It won't hurt you if you don't threaten it. But panic overtook Blake. He raised his rifle, hands shaking. Dad! Richard Thompson swung his own rifle toward the bobcat, his finger moving to the trigger. No! Ethan shouted, lunging forward. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. As Thompson prepared to fire, the forest erupted in movement. Not just the bobcat, but deer, birds, small mammals, creatures of all kinds suddenly appeared, surrounding the hunters in a bizarre display of unified presence. Thompson faltered, his rifle lowering slightly as confusion overtook his features. What the hell? The bobcat stood at the center of this strange gathering, unmoving, its eyes locked on Thompson. It wasn't aggressive, but its posture conveyed an unmistakable message. This forest and its inhabitants would not be intimidated. The men looked around in disbelief as squirrels scampered boldly at their feet, birds swooped uncomfortably close to their heads, and deer stood their ground just yards away. It was as if the entire ecosystem had mobilized in a show of solidarity. Dad? Blake's voice cracked with uncertainty. What's happening? Richard Thompson had gone pale, his weathered face registering something close to awe. A lifetime in these forests had taught him to respect nature's power, if not its right to exist undisturbed. But this organized response challenged everything he understood about the wild. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes. Then, from the trail behind them, came the sound of vehicles and voices. Sheriff Tanner appeared, accompanied by James, Madison, and 2 state wildlife officers. Thompson, the sheriff called out, lower those weapons now! The spell broken, the animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. Only the bobcat remained, its gaze still fixed on Ethan, a silent communication passing between them. As the state officers explained to Thompson that hunting without a permit would result in serious charges, Ethan approached the bobcat carefully. The magnificent creature waited, allowing him to come within a few feet. Thank you, Ethan whispered. Somehow you understood. The bobcat blinked slowly, then turned and disappeared into the forest once more. In the days that followed, the incident at the ridge became the talk of Pine Ridge. The witnesses, Thompson's men, Ethan, Madison, James, and the officials, all had slightly different accounts of what had transpired. But one detail remained consistent. Something extraordinary had occurred, something that defied conventional explanation. The state wildlife assessment, accelerated in light of the confrontation, determined that the bobcat posed no threat to humans. Furthermore, the disputed land was officially designated as protected territory, ending Thompson's logging ambitions in the old-growth forest. Richard Thompson, shaken by what he had witnessed, withdrew his complaint against Ethan and Madison. Whether from a newfound respect for the forest or simply a desire to distance himself from the bizarre incident, he announced that Thompson Logging would focus on sustainable practices going forward, working with rather than against conservation efforts. One evening, as the autumn colors reached their peak, Ethan sat on the porch with Madison and his father, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you think we'll see it again?" Madison asked. Ethan smiled. "I know we will. Not because it needs our help or protection anymore, but because we're connected now. Not just to the Bobcat, but to everything. Out there." James, who had been the most skeptical throughout, nodded thoughtfully. "Your mother used to say that nature speaks to those who listen. I always thought it was just a poetic way of appreciating the outdoors. But now," he trailed, off gazing toward the tree line where, just barely visible in the fading light, a familiar silhouette watched over them. The bond between a boy and a wild bobcat had done more than save 2 lives. It had awakened a community to the profound, mysterious connections that exist between all living things. In the heart of Montana's wilderness, an unlikely friendship had become a testament to nature's capacity for understanding, compassion, and resilience, qualities that many had believed were uniquely human, but which flourished throughout the natural world for those willing to see them. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, Ethan knew that his life had been forever changed. The forest was no longer simply a place of retreat or recreation. It was a complex community of which he was one small, humble part. And somewhere within its depths, a bobcat roamed. Not just a wild animal, but a guardian, a teacher, and a friend who had shown a human boy the true meaning of connection in a world that too often forgot the silent covenant between humankind and the wilderness that had nurtured us since the beginning of time. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and the Bobcat's extraordinary journey has touched your heart and perhaps changed how you view the natural world around us. For more captivating stories that explore the mysterious connections between humans and wildlife, we've prepared a special playlist that delves into similar emotional adventures. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If this tale of mutual protection and understanding moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the unexpected bonds that define our existence. Don't miss our upcoming content that will transport you to new worlds of emotion and discovery. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.